Now, what I want to talk about today is called the 4 levels of separation, and this is really one of the key elements of mixing, in my opinion, or at least in my workflow, when it comes to how I decide to add elements to the track and how I decide to make sure that an element is sitting in the mix the right way. And the way to go about this is I really have to give you an overview of my entire mixing philosophy, and that is that at the end of the day, you can think of sounds as having different functions. So for example, in this project over here, the kick drum has the function of being the main element that we're dancing to. When we're dancing onto this beat, the main thing that we're going to be making our biggest movement towards is going to be this kick drum. Then there's going to be extra groove elements that are going to sit on top, which are going to be these top loops. You can immediately see my head starting to bounce as the track becomes already instantly groovy. And then of course we need to fill up the empty spaces, which we're doing with this bass line. And then we need to create interest in the middle, which we're doing with sequences. Now, before we dive deeper in the 4 levels of separation, let's talk about the 4 levels of subscription, because you can just be subscribed to the channel, but you can also like the video, you can also leave a comment, and you can even become a member. So that's 4 levels. Anyway, if you want to do any of those things, I think you know where to find them. So thank you for all of the support, and now let's get back into the video. And you can already see that we're talking about different sounds into having different functionalities, different purposes within the actual track. And now then there's a second thing that you need to have for each of the sounds, and that is kind of like a priority in the mix. How important is this sound to the overall picture of the track? And some sounds are very, very important. Of course, the kick being the main element is going to be a very important sound. The bass line going to be a main element. It's going to fill up that low end. That is going to be a very important sound. All of the big sequences that you're really going to hear that are really maybe like the big melodies and that kind of stuff, those are very, very important. And of course, they need to be upfront in the mix. And then you're going to have background sounds, those little particles that just add a little bit of extra details, a riser that just adds a little bit of extra tension, a crash which is maybe signifying the start of a new section or just a general impact. And then you're going to have like your actual detail sounds, like your ambiances, your pads and all of your atmospheres, stuff that in general just sits a little bit more in the background of the mix and just adds a little bit of interest as opposed to being the main element that captures the attention. So once you have that for all of the sounds, once you have that decided, what you need to do is you need to put each element into the pockets that it needs. And to do that, we can really think of it in 4 different dimensions or 4 different levels of separation, as I like to call them. And the very first one is already kind of fixed, and that is going to be time. I guess it's the easiest to see in the sequences over here, especially if I quickly go out of this window. You can see that there's a whole bunch of different sequences, and you can imagine that if they were to all play together at the same time, it's going to be an absolute mess. But of course, the first level of separation, which we can see, is going to be time separation. As you can imagine, this is separated with this sequence because it's playing in a different point of time. This is all separated with this sequence and this stuff over here because this is playing later. Of course, these are still on top of each other, so they need to be separated in different ways, but a part of the track is naturally just going to be time separated once it's placed into the mixing stage, because of course that is something that is determined in the production. Now this is actually fairly important to understand because it does give you an insight in the fact that you need to make your production so that it becomes mixable. You cannot just have a whole bunch of different sounds on top of each other and expect it to just work. Even within these sounds, if we zoom in, you can probably see that they're actually quite separated in that they're all playing in slightly different areas and they're not really overlapping. They're overlapping from time to time, but sometimes there's like little pauses, little gaps and that kind of stuff. But still, you can imagine that I need to do some work in order to make sure that all of these elements are going to actually fit well together within this individual instance of time, which is just going to be this section over here in which this part is playing. So that brings us to the other 3 levels of separation, and those are going to be volume separation, frequency separation, and stereo separation. Now I can probably end the video there because most people are going to know what that means in the most basic form. If you have a very loud sound and a very quiet sound, they're going to be volume separated because one is going to overpower the other and it's just going to draw out the other completely, and therefore they're sounding separated. They're not sounding as one sound, they're sounding like one very loud sound and one very quiet sound. Same with frequencies. If you have a low frequency sound and a high frequency sound, they're separated. They're not the same sound. If they are both playing in the same frequency range, if it's like a very big overlap that they have, then it's going to be more considered as the same sound. And finally, stereo separation, there's a bunch of different ways that you can think of that. You can, of course, have panning if one is in the left channel and one is in the right channel. then you're going to have stereo separated sounds because one is playing there and one is playing over there. But this really is kind of an extension of general stereo width. I would say it's more of a particular case of stereo width separation. It tends to be the case that something that sounds very mono and something that sounds very stereo are also sounding very separated. And to be quite honest, panning something to the left and panning something to the right is just a very specific way of changing the stereo image of a sound. And there's many different ways that you can actually change the stereo image of the sound, not just by panning. And actually a very common plugin in all of my mixes is this M stereo spread over here. This is just used to increase the stereo width of a sound without actually panning it left and right. Of course, you can overdo it like I did over here, but that is just mainly there for the example. But you can hear that it's starting to sound really like it's coming from almost outer space, like it's not really in the center anymore. And that is really how I like to think of it. And what that kind of means is that you can kind of create a three-dimensional box almost, where you have the stereo width, you have the frequency, which is going up and down, and then you have the level, and that is just going to be how far away is it going to be in the mix. Of course, the sound that is playing further away is going to be quieter. But what that also means is that you can almost think of the mix as almost like a three-dimensional thing that happens, and you're just trying to position the sounds in there three-dimensionally. Of course, kick and bass is going to be the nice fundamental area, so that is going to sit in the lowest parts. And that is going to occupy the bass region. It is going to sit very mono. It is going to sit mainly in the center. So that area is going to be taken care of in the mix. And then your top drums are going to sit in the center all the way at the top, at the highest frequencies, because that is where they are going to be the most active. And of course, any of the other sounds that you have in your mix are also going to have to fit in that box. Now, to judge if elements actually need extra separation, what I like to do is I like to think of it, again, in this system of priorities and just thinking of it in the functionality of each of the sounds. Saying that, okay, I have these grid synths over here, for example, but I also have this other digital kind of sound over here. You have some more FM sounds over here as well. Of course, all of this together is going to create a singular idea, which is going to be what is playing on top of the kick and bass over here. I can imagine that the big vocal and all of that stuff isn't leaving us a lot of space either. So of course, all of that stuff is going to be taken into account in the mix as well. But the main thing that I now have to decide is, okay, given that I have this, for example, big vocal over here that is taking up a lot of this space, where I'm going to carve this out. For example, one of the things that I may end up doing, or which I may already have done, is removing some high frequencies over here. So for example, like this for the particles. You can imagine that this is a nice space where I want my drums to be. You can already see that I'm carving out the space for the low frequencies of my bass line as well. So now I'm really just restricting it to the mid-range and really separating it more from the drums as well as from my kick and bass line. And as you can imagine, you just have to do that for every single element. You have to think, okay, what's competing with this? What is more important than this? Where does it need to duck below a certain sound? Where does it need to go over a certain sound? And based on that, you have to find the settings that make sure that the sound actually does what you expect it to do. Now, I know that if you're just diving into mixing and you don't have the ear yet, or maybe not even the tool set yet for just general mixing and getting a good sound out of it, it may sound very frustrating that I'm not just giving you more perspective on how to actually do it, how to just set up a mix that works well. And that is because a large part of this comes with time and comes with experience. You just need to develop your listening skills and your attention to detail, but also to a certain extent your listening environment as well. I do think that your listening skills are more important than your listening environment, but I'm definitely aware of the fact that the listening environment does have a massive impact on the way that you're actually listening. And of course, one of the things that I always recommend is that you do a lot of referencing. Usually when it comes to mixing, right before my mixing sessions, I do an hour of listening to other people's music, just so that I have a taste of what other people's music is sounding like. And what I mean by, of course, other people's music is the reference material that I'm working on with the actual album that I'm working on, with the actual track that I'm working on. And that is just there to give me a fresh ear going into the actual mixing session. But it's also just an exercise that I do every day. Even when I'm not mixing, I generally listen to a lot of music because it just keeps you fresh and it keeps you paying attention to details. It keeps you, especially if it's the same music over and over again, you keep analyzing it more and more and more, and you get more kind of familiar with how a track is supposed to sound on your system. And therefore you can also adapt your music more to other people's music and make it sound similar to them. And if you think about it, part of the mixing aspect is usually that, making sure that your track sounds similar to other people's tracks so that it actually sounds nice to the audience that you want to target. I would say right now I'm on like my 30th, maybe 40th mix roughly here, if you count all of the client mixes and everything that I've done. And I've noticed that it does get easier over time, that your ear just gets more and more adapted, that your decision making gets quicker, that your identification of frequencies get quicker, that your decision making with regards to exactly what separation techniques to adopt, which level of separation to use to actually separate two different elements. Are you going to turn the volume down, or are you going to make one of the elements wider? Are you going to remove some of the frequencies of one element? Whatever decision that you make, if you do it more and more and more, you end up making more and more the right decision, in my opinion. So when it comes to that prospect of, oh, when I do it, it's not sounding good, it's not sounding like the pros yet, yeah, just do it 10 more times, do it 12 more times and see where you're at that point. Of course, part of it is going to involve also having good productions, but also part of it is just doing it over and over again until you're good at something. So that's everything that I want to talk about for today. These are the levels of separation and also a little bit on just generally learning mixing. Really, that is kind of what I want to do with this series, is just make general awareness of mixing. I started off with the idea that this was going to be a series that is mainly going to focus on little tricks that I discover and all of that kind of stuff. But I found myself just more interested in the general stuff about mixing and the overview over mixing. And in my opinion, it's much more important talking about the mindset and all of that stuff. And then you're going to figure out the little tricks yourself. Of course, there's also plenty of tricks going to come in the series. Don't get me wrong, still stay subscribed and all of that good stuff. But either way, up until this point, I'm getting a little bit more into the mindset than the actual tricks of this series. And I don't know if that's something that you guys are into, if that's something that you guys like. Honestly, I wouldn't be able to tell, because with the way that I'm recording these, I'm probably going to have the last one recorded before the first one is ever posted. So I hope that you guys enjoy this, and I hope that you find this kind of stuff useful. Let me know if you do by leaving a like, and make sure that you're subscribed. Another way to support the channel is by checking out my products, which you can do over on Gumroad, Payhip, or Adrenochrom's new community store. You can also become a member on my YouTube channel or on my Patreon, which gets you some awesome benefits. So thank you if you do that. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.